Hello, everyone. Good evening. Assalamu alaikum. I'm happy to be here with you tonight on this live broadcast. And I'm going to speak to my friend, Muhammad Ali Mojarradi. Muhammad Ali is a translator. He's interested in poetry, and he is interested in Persian literature. And recently, he started a hashtag on Twitter. Hashtag Rumi was Muslim. It's a very important subject. Wa alaikum salam, received wisdom. Words in Salhati. Everybody, thank you for joining. Idiot from the future. I don't think you're an idiot if you're listening to us. Words in Salhati. That's very interesting, by the way. I had a chat with the gentleman behind this account, Salhati. I think it's a dialect of Bengali. Yeah, I think that's what it is. Oh, so here he is. Persian poetics. Persian poetics. Let's add Persian poetics and have a chat. Okay. So I think he's on with us right now.
Assalamu alaikum.
Hello, alaikum assalam. How are you, my friend?
It's good to see you.
Muhammad, it's very good to see you. It's been a while, we've been talking about doing this together, and it's good that we managed to do this tonight.
Definitely, alhamdulillah.
So I'm very interested in talking to you today about, I was just talking to our audience about Rumi was Muslim. So let's jump right into it. Now, I think
Sure.
most of our followers know that you're a translator, you translate poetry. Is that correct?
Right, it is
Okay,
correct.
cool. And it's mostly from Persian to English.
Right, I would say about 99% of it is from Persian to English, but there are some Arabic phrases and sentences and quotes that are kind of become part of Persian in a way. So they're not Persian, but everyone would think of them as Persian. So if I say Wallah or Ruza Alas or things like that, even though it's directly from Arabic, everyone knows, So
Okay.
it's kind of actually goes to what your page is, kind of the ethos of your page is, bringing about these words and concepts that we all share, but we don't really quite think about it that way.
So I would guess that your studies in Arabic, I mean, you studied Arabic in the Arab world. And in fact, this is the advice you give to people when they ask you how to learn a language. You should actually
Right.
go to the place where it's taught. And I think that
Definitely.
helps you with better understanding the Persian texts, I would assume.
Definitely, yeah. I think that's one issue that modern Iranians have with trying to understand the Persian text of days past is they kind of look at the text, but they don't know the Arabic grammar or words that are there. So sometimes the text can be lost. So, for example, there's some terms that are in Arabic that are very common in poetry, but in Persian they're not there. Or maybe the context in Arabic is different than in Persian. And maybe if I pull out the divans, I can probably come up with a really quick example. But essentially, modern Iranians, most of the time when they struggle to understand these poems, it's from the point of view of not understanding the words that are directly from Arabic. So, for example, when you open up the first divan of Hafiz, the first line in the poem is in Arabic, the last line is in Arabic. And if you look at a lot of words, ja'ad, for example, when you say ja'ad, that means curly hair. But a modern Iranian would not know that ja'ad or muj'ad, what that means. Sharat muj'ad, muj'ada. They wouldn't know that, but that's used in Hafiz. So I definitely think that learning.
Yeah, I think
curly
the
hair, right?
vocalization. Yeah, we still use that word. It's a common Arabic word, muja'ad.
Beautiful, right? Or for example, the word manzil. In Arabic, it means home, and Persians know that means home, but in Arabic, Sufi poetry has a very specific connotation of like a spiritual state, right? But
And I
maybe
think
a
in
modern
Urdu,
Iranian.
in fact, it's destination. The
Really?
word manzil, yes.
Interesting. So yeah, I mean, if you look at any type of, like, for example, the last sentence, "Mata ma talaga min tahwa dal dunya wa ahmilha," right? So any Arab would know what that means, but Persians, they read it, they just kind of skip over it, they go to the next line. And that used to be, part and parcel of being an educated Iranian, Persian, South Asian was learning the Arabic language, right? So I think it's kind of a tragedy that in the modern world no one's really learning the Arabic language anymore. So my goal of going to the Arab world and learning Arabic was kind of revive for myself, really, this tradition of learning Arabic as a second language for educated Muslims. Not only because, it's helpful, of course I need it for this as well, but I just personally love to do that type of thing.
So in the same sense that a educated European could not dispense with Latin or Greek, I think educated Muslims, up until perhaps 100 years ago, had to know Arabic, not just
right, yeah.
Not just
it was a must. It was a must for sure. There was no ifs, ands, or buts about it. You had to learn the Arabic language, and it was kind of almost in the sense that learned European people would learn Latin, for example, or the English would learn French to engage with those texts. That's what Muslims would always do. They would always, that was like step one really in any type of higher education, was you immediately learn Arabic.
And also Persian. I mean, either the Turks and, Turks in the wider sense of the word, as in Turkic people, they had to learn Persian at some point. The educated Turkic people, they had to learn Persian.
Right,
and plus, in the subcontinent, Persian was actually an official language up until the British decided to change it.
Right. I think one of the biggest tragedies of our modern paradigm is this monolingualism that is emerging in our countries, where we have this concept of, I have this country and this is the language in my country, and any other language is the other country's language. Right. So you have this thing where people associate now Persian with the modern state of Iran, with Shia Islam, with whatever. Whereas Persian used to be the language that all Muslims, regardless of ethnic or sectarian or whatever connotation that you had or whatever, everyone learned it because it was the language of the Bustan and Gulistan and Hafiz and Rumi. Right. But nowadays, someone actually from South Asia messaged me and said that people who are from one religious background are more likely to learn Arabic, and people from another religious background are more likely to learn Persian. And I really lament the fact that we've divided ourselves up like this,
Actually, one of our followers just commented that in Pakistan, people used to learn both Persian and Arabic up until 50 years ago.
Right. This is probably one of the most common comments that I get from people from South Asia, is showing me things, letters, books, handwriting from their ancestors that are in the Persian language that they can't read anymore because that education has slowly, shifted the focus away. And I remember one time specifically, a gentleman from Multan, Pakistan, sent me a letter that his grandfather had, one of his last letters towards his old age, and he had scribbled in the corner, "An ra ke muhasabe pak ast, az ruz hisab che bak ast," which means the one who has a clean slate, or literally clean waiting thing, what fear does he have for the day of judgment? So I thought that was like a really meaningful bait that he had written on the corner of his page, towards the end of his life, and it's just such a tragedy that in the modern world, his descendant couldn't understand that.
That's very classical. These kind of inscriptions. You have poets and people of letters, men and women of letters, writing these kinds of quips. It's very interesting, especially when you do it in the classical languages. Very enriching, I would say.
Definitely, yeah. It was a symbol. I can definitely see that it was a symbol of education and a certain stance to have these types of, these quips or these couplets, at your command, let's say, and writing. And even if you see nowadays in texts, Islamic texts that are written in Urdu or things like that, or Arabic, sometimes in the subcontinent, there's little couplets in Persian that are dropped in there and translated to kind of make a point.
So let's go back to the subject that we, opened with, which is Rumi was Muslim. I want you to tell me more about that. Now,
sure.
You started translating Persian texts, I think, 2 years ago, right?
I think it's up to 3 years ago now is when I started translating them, right?
Yes, so actually, this will be excuse me, I was just going to say to one of the followers, this will be saved on IGTV because people are asking about that. So, so sorry for cutting you off, Muhammad. So you started 3 years ago, and tell me about that phase.
Sure. So when I started years ago, I'm sure I must have thought they existed, but I was not aware of the corpus of English translated poetry from Persian, right? I just would see poems on Instagram mostly and translate them for my friends, who were mostly Arabs, but a lot of them maybe had Persian ancestry or their families had visited Iran. They were interested. And then the more I did it, the page grew, and then people started to interact with me. I started to become aware, people would send me covers of books that were, Persian poetry in English. I didn't really pay it any mind until, I came across a copy of quote unquote Rumi, and I think it was a bookstore in my university town, and I pretty quickly realized that it was more Rumi inspired than actually Rumi. But I didn't really think much about it. And until in class one day, someone brought that up and said, hey, I read Rumi, but it didn't feel like the Rumi that I'd read in my grandpa's Arabic Rumi. So we had a case of an Arab speaker who had read Arabic translation from 100 years ago, which of course is going to be faithful, and a modern translation. And then I thought, wait a minute, there's something deeper here. So I came across this New York, I think not Times, this New York, I think Daily, something. And the New Yorker had an article about this. And so I started talking about it on Instagram. And then I started translating more Rumi, which up to then I hadn't really translated so much of him. And basically what happened was I started translating more and more of his poetry. And I talked about the fact that, you know, he was Muslim, but he's been Orientalized. If you look at my highlight on my story, called Reflections. There's actually one of my oldest posts is about that. It's from, you know, many months ago. My Patreon, the first post was about that. But one day I was just talking to my friend Zirar, and he's at Zirrar, and he has done campaigns on the internet before. And he said, you know, you and I have talked about this before on Instagram stories. Why don't we make it a campaign? And I thought, you know, how would it be a campaign? Would we like write 1 million letters to Coleman Barks, you know, spamming his house? And he said, no,
So
why don't we just
tell our viewers who Coleman Barks is.
Right, so Coleman Barks is essentially the main beef that the Rumi was Muslim movement has. He's essentially this now 80-year-old guy, but he was in middle age when he encountered Rumi. He grew up in this kind of post-boomer, which is like 1960 hippie era in America, where in the 1940s America was really industrialized, and there was suburbs and, you know, single-family homes, and then their kids, in a truly American fashion, were tired of that and rebelled. They wanted to live in cities, in the woods, and they were, you know, the hippie movement. You can look into that and read about it. And these people got an interest in the East because they felt that their Protestant Christianity, you know, if you think of Christianity as not maybe a spiritual Sufism, Protestantism is like the least spiritual version of it, right? It's very by the book.
Catholicism is much more magical than Protestantism.
Right. So they were, you know, they didn't have the saints and spiritual Catholicism. So they were done. They wanted something different. So they looked eastward, and they started finding Hinduism and Buddhism, and some people started to find Sufism via Islam. Some Muslims were moving to the West. And anyway, so people like Coleman Barks started to encounter Sufi sheikhs and teachers, and he comes across an old translation of Rumi. You know, he's looking into Sufism, but he finds that Rumi has only been translated in the Victorian era. That's the original wave of Orientalist translators who became interested in Muslim poetry, right? So people like Nicholson and all those people, and Fitzgerald, essentially British colonial subjects who were living in these colonies a lot of the times. They got interested and they learned the native language. You know, they were sitting there in their office in Delhi without much to do. They had like a gentleman-like side thing. The first guy who translated Hafiz, his name was Sir Henry Wentworth Clark. You know, you can just imagine the type of person, just based on the name, who he must have been, right? It's almost a meme.
They were gentlemen scientists or gentlemen scholars.
Right. So they were coming at this with a very British Victorian mindset. So when they translated Muslim poetry and they came across things that, you know, we would say wouldn't be appropriate for family viewing, let's say, they couldn't make that mesh together. Why would a religious text have a section that talks about sexuality, right? Because to them, that was the ultimate taboo. We're talking about Victorian England where table legs had covers, lest the leg, you know, become an innuendo. So they come across a poem where Rumi is creating an analogy. You know, he says in Arabic, he said, what was it? إذا زنيت فأذن بالحرة وإذا سرقت فأسرق بالدرة. So he comes across this.
I'm going to get in trouble for this one, man. إذا زنيت فأذن بالحرة.
Yeah, so he comes across this in Rumi's book, and he says, how could a Muslim scholar have written this? This is so lewd. So what they did was they actually translated the lewdness into Latin, because the common people of the day could not understand Latin. That process had already begun, the death of Latin. So what happens is people like Coleman Barks look into this text and they say, first of all, you know, it's a full translation as well, but it's very archaic, and all of the lewdness is in Latin, right? It's totally useless to the modern type of like 1960s viewing. So what they did was, without any actual knowledge of Persian, they went in and they kind of retranslated the translation. But because of their lack of understanding, they kind of butchered it completely. And in a reaction to the prudeness of the Victorian era, they tried to highlight the sexuality. So when you approach Rumi in translation, you find this weird mix of like poor translations, a lot of weird like excessive insertions of sexuality. So it just generally, it was a mess. So me and him thought, okay, what are we going to do about this? And I could talk at length as far. He said, why don't we create a title for it so people can say it? And first we thought Nada Rumi, then we thought Rumi something, we thought, oh, perfect, Rumi was Muslim. You know, and this will have the appeal of, you know, Muslims generally will be interested in that type of labeling, right?
So what you guys are doing, in fact, is reclaiming Rumi and his Muslimness. And but don't you think that your work, in a sense, is based upon the work of these, you know, Victorian scholars, gentlemen scholars who work on exposing these aspects of the West? Because, you know, back then they were interested in not only in the, you know, in Arabic-speaking, Persian-speaking culture, they were interested also in Chinese culture and Indian culture.
Right.
And in fact, you know, you might know this, obviously, I'm an amateur linguist. I'm very interested about...
above amateur. Give yourself more credit than that.
Thank you very much, my friend. And as you know, my favorite subject is Perso-Arabic influenced languages. And in my researches about languages like Sindhi, Pashto, Punjabi, I came across very old texts written by these Englishmen. You know, they were mostly Englishmen. Some of them were in the service of the army, of the British Army, of the East India. Was it called the East India Company? And exactly. So basically, what I'm saying is that. Okay, so I'm saying is that don't we sort of owe these gentlemen a kind of gratitude, you know, for lack of a better word, for exposing these translations? What you're doing is more of a corrective thing than perhaps a critical thing.
So my beef is more with the modern reworking of these original translations. In fact, I think one people maybe misunderstand this is, I want to clarify, the original scholars, their work is, we're indebted to them and they're very appreciated. In fact, before the Victorians came to us, we had a very bad situation with the manuscripts. Because in our Muslim mindset, the only book that we are crazy serious about the preservation of was the Quran, right? Everything else for that, everything other than that, right? We have this very Middle Eastern loosey-goosey, you know, we're not like very serious, detailed, hyper-detailed people about those things the way the Victorians were, right? We didn't care, like Hafiz Divans, for example, you get one with 400 ghazals to 800 ghazals, Khayyam from 100 rubaiys to 1,000 rubaiys. And the Victorians came and they said, well, wait a minute, so which one is it? And we thought, oh, they're all that. You know, we have this Allahu Alam, you know, God knows type of thing. And the Victorians said, no, we want the Divan of Rumi, or we want the Masnavi. Which one did Rumi write? So the Muslims at the time, they didn't really care, you know, even up to the texts that are very foundational in our scholarship, our body of scholarship, they have variations in them. Like if you look at hadith corpuses, the Ilm al-Rajal, they're constantly arguing about, you know, which hadith is the correct one. So we had this idea that there could be variations and there could be a level of ikhtilaf, and we'll accept that, right? That applied to this poetry. But the Victorians came and said, no, we want to produce the closest version possible to what the original author wrote. And they coined that the critical edition. So someone like Nicholson went around purchasing copies of the Masnavi manuscripts at the time, by the way. They weren't even printed by then. We hadn't even gotten to that point. They were still in manuscript form. SubhanAllah, how many texts were just lost for that reason? You know, not just the Mongols, but just being lost. You know, a bookworm, building on fire. So he went and collected all of these manuscripts, and they produced actually the first typesetted version of them so they could be mass produced for the people. Before then, you had to go interact with someone, a scholar in a Zawi or a Sufi center who had a written copy and memorize that or write it down and go home. So he said, no, we're going to collect as many as we can in India or wherever, and we're going to create a critical edition of the Masnavi. And by God, Nicholson went blind by the time he finished his Masnavi project. He took this enormous 60,000 couplet book, produced an authoritative edition, and then typesetted it and translated it. And over that period, he actually went blind. So, and even to this day in modern Iran, when you buy a Masnavi, it says, Tibq Tashiyeh Ustad Nicholson in Iran. So they really, I don't know, if I say this, some people who are more anti-colonial than me will accuse me of having this colonized mindset of, how could we thank them? But no, we really have a debt. We owe a debt to anyone who is interested in this stuff and put a scholarly effort towards it, right?
But this is
So yeah, they
normal. I mean,
definitely
for
added
one
it.
civilizational culture to perfect the works of another civilization. I mean, at one point, Arabic-speaking Muslims, Muslims who wrote and spoke in Arabic, even though they might not have been, Arabs per se, we picked
Yeah.
up the works of ancient Greece,
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
we translated them with the help
Definitely.
of Syriac translators, Syriac Christian translators, into Arabic, and then you had people like Averroes, Ibn Rushd, who wrote critical versions basically of these works, and
Right,
we
yeah.
preserved
Right,
them
yeah.
for the West. So I don't think that is strange in any sense. And there's a well-known hadith by the Prophet, peace be upon him, al-hikmah dallatul mu'min. Wisdom is the thing that the mu'min, that the faithful person should look for, and it doesn't matter
Right.
where you look for it. Even if it be in
As
China.
far as China.
Exactly.
Right, yeah.
So let's go back to Coleman Barks. What exactly was your beef with Coleman Barks? I mean, from an academic and technical point of view.
Right, right. So my beef essentially is we have someone who has no academic credentials who's approaching this. That on its face value is not so terrible. I mean, anyone can write any book and say, hey, this is my effort. And it could be, maqbul or mardud. And the difference is that Coleman Barks became Rumi in America. So I always tell people if there was like 100 Rumi translations in America and 99 of them were different people and one was Coleman Barks, I wouldn't even care about him. The issue is that he approached basically a state of affairs where there was no modern translation of Rumi, or at least one that people knew about. And his became so well selling, it sold so well that he produced like a dozen of them. He has a dozen different Rumi books. So nowadays, if you go to buy Rumi, every single book is by him. Go to a bookstore, go to Amazon, go to eBay, type in Rumi, ask for Rumi. It's always by this dude, and he has no academic credentials. Academics don't take his work seriously. And anyone who is an academic in the field will always recommend, Jawed Mujaddidi, Nicholson, Alan Williams, a real academic translator who
Does he
is
present
credentialed.
himself as an academic?
No, he doesn't. And one way that he avoids serious criticism is he always notes that when he speaks, I'm not an academic. I don't know Persian. I'm indebted to the academics. But no one digs out his videos, or no one even reads the prefaces where he has like 2 paragraphs explaining that. They just go straight to the poem. And even to the point where the vast majority of Muslims who are familiar with Rumi have been familiarized via these Coleman Barks quotes that go on the internet. And another issue is most people know his work via the internet, not via the books. So the internet posts don't have a preface that say, by the way, the person who translated this isn't a translator. This is a highly stylized rendering that's inspired by the original. No, they just, of course they're not going to say that. So this is why I take a beef with him, because he really kind of he is Rumi in America, really. It's his personality that is Rumi. It's just people don't know that.
And what exactly is the issue with his translations per se? I mean, did he de-Islamicize the translations? Did he sort of take anything
Right.
Islamic or out of them? And what does that mean for Rumi? I mean, what does that mean? Like, imagine, for example, if you took the works of, say, St. Augustine, and then you took out all the Christian aspects of
Right, yeah,
those works. I mean,
exactly,
what would the result?
Right, exactly. And then this is the biggest issue is personally when I translate, I keep the form of the original poem. So that includes the ghazal form, the rhymes, whatever, sometimes the meter if it's possible. That's difficult and not every poet does that. Some poets do prose translation. And that's what Coleman Barks does. That's one issue I have. I think that's not as good a deal as you can have with the rhyming, but I figure, okay, the biggest issue, or even if sometimes he inputs sexuality and stuff, I find that weird, but I mean, sometimes it's plausible rendering. I mean, who knows? The biggest issue is what you've mentioned, which is the de-Islamicizing. And when we bring this up, people a lot of times think that we mean that like Rumi has to be read like a fiqh book, or that Rumi is only for Muslims. No, that's not what we mean. What we mean is that the issue is that Rumi can only be appreciated within the context of Islam. So, for example, if you look at, I mean, I don't want to create a bad rap for Islam, but generally speaking, we've kind of developed a bad reputation for the way we've interacted with non-believers, right? So according to our theology, Christians and Jews, they're people of the book. their meat should be halal and things like that. But a lot of times, in reality, that didn't play out that way. That Muslims and Jews didn't get along, that we had issues and wars and expulsions, all that type of stuff. You know, there's no, like you tell me, there's no aib in history. It's just the truth. So when Rumi says, oh, you know, I see, when I look left and right, I see no difference between Christian, Jew, or Muslim. I see God in every direction. If you say that to an American, that's very benign. Yeah, of course. You know, look, there's a synagogue and a mosque and a church right next to each other in the street here. But when you say that in his context as a Muslim faqih, that's very controversial. That's very profound, right? We're talking about a milieu where the average theologian said, no, these people will go to hell because they don't believe in Islam. But when Rumi says, no, there's the light of God in every house of worship, that's incredible. So if we want to understand the depth and the beauty of Rumi and his true hikmah, we have to understand him within the context of Islam that he's operating from, right? And so much of the beauty is the analogies that he draws. Like when he has a poem where he says, you know, love, you're stronger than Solomon's ring, or you're more powerful than Solomon's ring, right? If you don't know what Solomon's ring is, or if you take that out, the beauty or the meaning of the poem is gone. You know, if you don't explain what Khatam al-Sulayman is, then it's so many, every one of his poems just flip to it at random. It kind of relies on the Islamic metaphors, even the metaphor of wine, right? If you don't take into account the Sufi metaphor and the prohibition and the taboo element, wine poetry almost feels like a juvenile undergraduate affair, right? It almost feels like, oh wow, poems about wine, that's so childish, right? And because it's not taboo here, but if you take into account his context, the deep, intense meaning of that symbolism emerges, right?
But as a translator, I mean, if you want to convey all of these aspects to an English-speaking audience, if you will, how can you cram all of these cultural sensibilities into the text? And perhaps it's counterproductive, because if you make it too scholarly, people are not going to read it. Like
this is a problem.
One of our viewers just commented that I'm not going to say the expletive, but they said, blank Coleman is making money off people's backs. I mean, in a sense, if you don't make it palatable to the market, is there any way that you can make it popular? That's my question. My second question is, maybe what he's producing, and I'm playing devil's advocate here, maybe what people like Coleman are producing is not the actual scholarly work. It's something inspired by Rumi. I mean, it's not the actual... Because once you translate, I mean, once you depart from the original context, the original language, can you really say that it's the same thing? That's my question.
Definitely, yeah. So to his credit, Coleman has always he personally advertises himself usually as an interpreter, and he gives those caveats that you just gave. The problem is the way he's been shown to other people is they introduce him as a translator, the foremost Rumi translator. That's an issue, right? Against that sometimes. And another issue is that, again, the absence of another step. So yeah, there's Coleman's translations, which are very non-academic. But an issue is that there's no academic translation available in the bookstore. Maybe that's a structural issue. A bookstore like a Barnes and Noble isn't a place academic translation of Coleman Barks of Rumi, for example. It's an issue that I contend. So China in the past was kind of thought of as this place where tea and rice emerged from, and there was all kinds of miniature painting. The concept of a miniature emerged from there. It was these beautiful kingdoms and things like.
I'm sorry, Muhammad Ali. I'm sorry, there was a disconnect in my video. Can you hear me?
Sure. I can back up a little bit.
Okay, so if you can just back up a little bit to the part where you were talking about the availability of these texts.
Sure, sure. So basically, I guess it's a structural issue where the academic texts are just available, right? So if you go to a bookstore and you want to get a good sense of Rumi, it's not marketed as here's the books that are really good, serious, scholarly translations, and here's kind of like a pop edition, right? That's not really, there's no sensibility there. People just kind of like get the book and they read it, and there is no scholarly sense of like, people, if they don't know this, which is the case for most, Western Anglophones, they don't think about the work of translating. Many monolingual people think of translating as just a word for word rendering. They're not aware that the translation takes in, like you said, departures and cultural context and milieu. Many people, when they learn a second language, they're actually amazed to realize that languages can be so drastically different from one another, right? So, for example, when Hafiz says, let's say, where it says, I can't find it here, but basically he says when the Surat Gerachin, when the painter of China saw your face, he couldn't stop painting it. So when you invoke China back then, you think of miniature paintings and, and glasses and teacups and amazing dynasties and ilm and a crazy far off place, a huge place, amazing. Nowadays, when you think of China and the Middle East, nothing against China, well, just the facts on the ground, it's thought of as basically xenophobically, clothes are made and weird people come from and their customs are not clean. So in modern day Iran, if you want to say something is bad, unfortunately, you say Chiniye. It's Chinese. I didn't make that up. It's the truth, right? So
they say that locally in Bahrain too. They say Chinawi, like it's Chinese produced.
Right. So to a middle Iranian reading these texts, when Hafiz alludes to China, it invokes these ideas of wonder and amazement that China is this extremely distant place that we will never probably see in our lives, average person would never see, where amazing relics. But even a modern Iranian struggles to think of China the same way. So let alone in translation, you render. So these are big issues that I come across. And my stance is I tend to keep the original as close as possible, and I have extensive notes. So inshallah, when my first book comes out, the readers can see I tend to keep it literal, and I explain the things in the notes, because I think that if I want to make it non-literal, I have to make decisions, and at the end of the day, who am I to make the decision one way or the other? So if I wanted to invoke feelings of awe and amazement, and China is no longer that place for various historical reasons, would I pick a different country? Would I change the thing? Would I say, I don't know, the Instagram photographer who saw you would never want to photograph another person again, right?
In my personal experience, it's always better to educate people regarding the original context. So one of our viewers just said that you can't understand Rumi without understanding Sufism. And even to the average Muslim, this is true. I mean, I'm not talking about Western people here. I'm talking about the average Muslim. Maybe, some Muslims don't have a clear view of what Sufism is. But when you learn more about Sufism, you get these ideas in a better sense. And in my opinion, it's always better to educate people, to teach them what these illusions are, because poetry is not just about, especially when you're studying poetry that old, it's not about the words per se. It's also about like you said, the milieu that is invoked. And I think this is the enriching part. I mean, it's not only an exercise in words, because otherwise, we'd be making up puns. That's not interesting. That's
100%.
That's boring.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
So, Mohali, I want to cover 2 points before we end this, and I don't want to make it too long, and I don't want to sort of tax your time here or our viewers' attention. I want to know about what happened on Twitter. You presented these ideas to the world. It blew up. Right, everybody on Twitter. You had like thousands of retweets, about thousands of followers. Journalists, journalism for what it's worth nowadays, picked up the story, and it's at least India, at least America, Britain. I want to know what happened and the sort of whirlpool that you found yourself in I
Right,
remember when
right.
we were talking at that point, you were sort of let me say a cultural celebrity, if I could put it that way, if that makes sense. You were a cultural vulture, and this was, yeah, and I mean, to your credit, maybe the idea
Mhm.
itself, is not original per se, but the way you presented it, the
Right,
way
right,
you
yeah.
brought it out to people, the way you connected to a younger audience, I think that played a very important part. So,
Right,
so tell
yeah.
us about what happened on Twitter.
Sure. I had written about this before, like I said, on my Instagram story, on Facebook. I had a status about it on, I've spoken about it every platform I've been on. But one thing I realized is, like you said, the method of bringing it up. The average person is only vaguely interested in Rumi. I mean, even Persians living in Persian speaking countries probably are only vaguely familiar with Rumi because, most people nowadays are not interested in this stuff. That's another discussion. But especially, in the English speaking world, if you were to write something, the second people hear Victorian era, Latin, critical edition, translation theory, cultural milieu, whenever they just hear those words and they block it out. Because if it's too technical and they're not in that field, it's disinteresting. The same way that when I go to the doctor, I just want him to give me the straight talk. I don't want him to give me, like you're a doctor, for example. If I go to you for some help, I don't want you to explain to me what you learned in medical school, right? I just want you to fix me.
Right.
So,
Yeah, I
same
would
thing
fix
with
your
this.
teeth, actually.
Right, yeah. So I
Yeah.
don't want you to explain to me what a cavity is. I just don't want to feel pain when I eat sweets anymore.
Right.
So basically, the way I think the difference with Twitter is, first of all, it was Ramadan, so everyone was on Twitter and bored, and it was people are hangry, like they say, hungry and angry. And Twitter kind of has this culture where the information needs to come in bite sizes, and Twitter also has this culture of threads. People put a lot of threads, and they like to uncover things. Twitter is where things are uncovered these days, or exposed, so to speak. And I actually didn't think much of Twitter. I thought, look, Instagram's an aesthetically pleasing platform for my work. I love it, and it has lives. Twitter is where there's memes and arguments and journalists bantering back and forth. What's the point of Twitter? But my friend, to his credit, Hamza, said, no, go on Twitter. Twitter is where your work will go viral eventually. And that's true. Instagram, things barely go viral, but it's very common for an average person on Twitter to randomly get 10,000 retweets if it hits the chord. So I posted this thread, and I think that using humor and pop culture, saying it's not a WhatsApp conspiracy, and posting DiCaprio and Brad Pitt and Ivanka
Mm.
Trump, and it just kind of feel like it hit the right marks, and it kept enough kind of pizzazz for every tweet to encourage people to continue reading. And I think that putting the best choice I did was comparing the translations. When people see the difference, it's one thing to say this is incorrect, but it's another thing to say compare it to something that is correct. And it was just like very in your face, and it kind of had this like mass appeal. And because also Twitter is a place where fake Rumi quotes circulate all the time, it kind of just hit the right note at the right
Mm.
moment. And I feel like Hamza, like a lot of people saw it, and I was really happy to see that type of
Mm.
response from people.
Don't you think it was part of a bigger tendency towards people talking about whitewashing? People talking about representation.
Yeah, for sure. I
Yeah.
fell into again, like the first article, the first time this was brought up to the Western discourse in public, like in an article on the New Yorker, was 2017. But now, like you said, the discourse is Hollywood and movies and books and voice actors. It's not just about Rumi, but this larger, not just in the West, but global conversation about, if people are represented in media and the arts, will they represent themselves or will someone represent them for them?
Mm.
So kind of just hit the right place in the right time.
And DiCaprio for Rumi, come on.
Right.
I'm not casting aspersions on DiCaprio as an actor,
Yeah.
but I don't know if he would have been right for the role. And who on God's green earth would they choose for Shems?
Yeah, I think it's impossible to.
Yeah.
And really, in an ideal world, maybe they can find two Sufis from
Mm.
Turkey or Iran who could also be actors in English or something like that, or they could do it in Persian and have them, approximate old Persian, and kind of
Yeah.
like they do now for British shows in the Middle Ages. But I'm almost glad that the movie didn't get made in a way. I feel like
They say that Americans don't like to read the movies, so that would be an issue. With all
right,
due
yeah, that's why
respect to
you see
our American, brothers out there.
you see movies in ancient Rome and they have British accents. I saw a
Mm.
tweet about that as a
So perhaps a movie about Rumi would be set would have to be translated into medieval Khurasani Persian or something like that.
That would be a beautiful. I mean, one of my favorite things. Again, I mean, you're a bigger linguistics guy than me, but for example, a movie like Gangs of New York, seeing that they actually put work and brought linguists to try to approximate how Irish and like British origin Americans would speak in the 50s. I mean, almost that in and of itself is more interesting to me than the movie, than the plot.
Exactly.
Just seeing 1 hour of accurate descriptions of the past, the way they spoke and dressed and acted, that in and of itself is more fascinating to me than whatever story they have about, elections and the Civil War and things like that.
And thank God these movies and TV shows, recently they've become more linguistically aware. Like if you watch something from the 80s or the 90s, it's like some, English-speaking dude goes to a distant galaxy and everybody speaks English. And nobody explains how that works. It's ridiculous.
Right, yeah. Right.
But nowadays, they come up with these devices to try to explain how people understand each other.
Tidbit is there's a genre of movies in the West called spaghetti westerns. And these were Western movies made in the 50s and 60s, basically, up until the 70s is when that genre kind of ended. But a lot of times they'd be filmed in deserts in either Italy or North Africa because it was cheaper than America and there was less regulations. And the extras, the bad guys, would be Italians. So they would speak in Italian, and then in the post, they would dub them over into English. But the hilarious part was the Italians, because they're like their skin tone, were playing the Mexican bad guys. So they could have just kept the Italian and it would have been closer to Spanish, but then they dub it into this American accent. So the guy's like, his mouth is moving one way and he's speaking in like a Texan American accent.
Okay, so Muhammad Ali, I want to get to the last part of our discussion. So we talked about the translations, we talked about bots, we talked about your claim to fame on Twitter, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I really hope that works out for you. I hope it brings more traction as far as your upcoming book is concerned.
I hope so.
So my last question to you is, how do we solve this? I mean, how do we deal with this? We want these works to be exposed. We want people to know about them, both in the West and the East. And basically, this is what it's about. I mean, look at you. You're originally from the Middle East, but you were born in America. You're an American. You bring these two worlds together, and there's this community of people, like you, and also people in the old countries and people in the West who want to get to know each other. So how do we bring these works to this audience without losing the authenticity, but not making it too difficult to access at the same time? What are your ideas on this?
I think it's up to people like me and you who are kind of straddling these two cultures and know our native language in English and we're interested in other languages to kind of step up and bridge this gap. Because ultimately, a Sufi peer in Afghanistan is not going to be able to translate Rumi to English, and a white guy in Texas is not going to be able to do it. It's going to have to be someone like us. And I think that so many of us, especially the ones who move to the West, we become we have this anxiety from our home countries, people from Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, that we desire stability so badly that we don't have time for creative endeavors. That so many of us in the diaspora, we just want a job and we don't want to do anything but our job. And if anything, people like you and me who do, not me right now, but who would essentially would have a career, if we have a non-career pastime that's something cultural, instead of in the West where they look up to it, they look down on it. And it just blows my mind where my family members call me and instead of saying, wow, you want to translate the Divan of Hafiz into English for the first time into poetry? That's an incredible achievement, like amazing. I hope you could do it. They'll say, when will you get a job? This is a waste of your time. Versus, we have this self-depreciating thing where we almost look at a hobby as a childish thing. That even if it's like an academic hobby, that it's a kiddish thing to do, that, be a serious adult. Our idea of a serious adult is someone who's no frills, no fun, just work. So we need to change our mindset and encourage more academic engagement with our culture, after work, after school, whatever, and encourage more hobbies and hawayat, as you guys say in Arabic. Hawayat. I don't think we really have a word for that in Persian. It goes to say a lot, So we need to encourage people to engage with this stuff and not have this, if you're not 100% career focused, you're like childish or a loser or something type of thing. It's a mindset change, almost in the way that the Westerners are the opposite of us. They're so fascinated with culture that they even branch out to other cultures and
they
like
do.
analyze them. Versus us, we're so uninterested that even our own culture is like withering, and we're not doing anything to revive it. You know?
Sometimes it blows my mind how Western people, I mean, they're very interested in objectivity. It's how deeply they master the languages and cultures of the East. Like I used to know a French guy, about a French guy who lived in Cairo, and he actually chose to live in one of the toughest neighborhoods in Cairo, and he spoke perfect Persian, perfect Arabic, Egyptian, Cairean Arabic. And then on the other hand, you have MENA people. I mean, I'm not talking about everyone, but some of them, they go to the West for years. They do their PhD, they study universities, and they still don't master English. So I don't think it's a question, obviously, of IQ.
100%.
It's a question of perhaps our culture does not. I mean, you talk about monolingualism. It does not support this, objectivity, this objective interest in scholarship and in languages.
I meet Iranians who've been living in America since 79, since 1980. So it's been 42 years, 41 years now for some of them, or 78. And they still say, when I came to America, there was not many Iranian here. They say gas station. And I'm like, come on, man. Like, I don't want to hate, like, languages are hard, but a lot of people don't learn the languages. And then, like you said, I meet like a random German guy in Tehran, and he says, من یک سال است که در دانشگاه تهران ادبیات فارسی میخوانم. Like, just like that.
Even I understood that. I've been studying Persian literature. And
right. Yeah. But even we pride ourselves on like our lack of understanding of other languages. Like my cousins say, I studied Arabic for 8 years in school, but I forgot it all. Good riddance. I didn't have to learn anything else.
So anyway, this has been very interesting, Muhammad Ali. I'm sure our viewers will be very interested in your work, and all of this dovetails with, as I said, the subject that I love, and that I love, which is, the Perso-Arabic influenced languages. I don't think it gets enough exposure, and I think we have to work on that too, because we have this vast body of, languages in the East, and also the literature, languages that belong to divergent language families like Persian, Turkish, Azeri, Uzbek, Punjabi, Urdu, Sindhi, hundreds of languages that are influenced by this culture, which is based on both the Arabic and Persian language. Arabic influence through Persian. And, this sort of, how can I put it? There's this union of expressions and words. And we hardly ever think about it. I mean, it exists organically, but we don't talk about it, we don't think about it. And this is where, our interest, comes in.
Definitely.
And this is where people like you come in. And like our viewers. And I would like to thank our viewers for the comments. I'm sorry I couldn't, respond to all your comments. Hopefully, we can respond in longer form in a future discussion. And thank you, Muhammad Ali, for being on with us again.
Thanks for having me.
I look forward to our next talk.
Inshallah, yeah, definitely.
So as you guys say,
on your topic, Perso-Arabic influenced languages, inshallah, next time.
That would be very interesting. Maybe on your account next time.
I would love to. I was about to say, I'd love to have you next time.
That would be great. So as you guys say, Khuda Hafiz, or maybe you should say Allah Hafiz.
Allah Hafiz. Ma salama.
Ma salama. Bi salamati. Bye.
Khuda Hafiz.